Hello, everyone, and welcome to the annual Healing City Summit. I'm Danielle Terrain, and I'm the director at OSI Baltimore. And I'm just really excited to kick off today's portion of the summit. It's entitled Baltimore and Beyond. Today, we will actually examine some of the steps Baltimore is taking to reduce and heal the effects of trauma that our residents face, and hear about trauma and healing and trauma responsive efforts throughout North America. We know that trauma born of violence, poverty, food scarcity, and other factors lead to the multi-layered problems that are happening in cities in Baltimore and around the world. We also know that we cannot punish or arrest our way out of problems born of trauma. Baltimore's Healing City Act of 2020 is a bold piece of legislation that aims to address trauma head on through things like teaching and learning about trauma and investing in community-based interventions that begin to heal our collective trauma. We are really proud to say that Baltimore is the first city in the country to actually legislate trauma responsive care, and that similar legislation is being adopted statewide. In our first session, you'll hear a bit about some of our homegrown practitioners who we're really proud of, who have been working in this field for years. In subsequent sessions, advocates, practitioners, and government officials from cities across North America join the discussion to share stories about work that is being done to heal trauma in their communities. The goal here is to learn about some of the most effective practices that can be replicated and scaled for the benefit of multiple communities. OSI Baltimore is really proud to be a strong supporter of Healing City Baltimore. And our goal is to spread Healing City's momentum to cities around the country and beyond. We really hope that today will serve as a first step in helping to seed this movement more broadly. And we really look forward to interacting with you guys and hearing your feedback. You see in the chat, we really encourage you guys to introduce yourselves and engage with the material that you hear throughout the day. So next up, we'll share a brief video about Healing City Baltimore. Thank you so much.
After a shooting at the Frederick Douglass High School in February of 2019, students from Douglass showed up to a hearing at City Hall to share their thoughts about what needed to be done.
Just knowing that we dealt with so much trauma outside of schools, gun violence, homelessness, food insecurities, it just really impacted how we went through life and how we saw things and how we experienced things. And just knowing that we had to go to school and deal with the same things that we were trying to escape from in real life, it made things a lot harder for us.
A lot of the adult conversation at the time was centered on, should we have more metal detectors? Should school police be armed while they're in the school building? But when the young people got up to testify, they wanted nothing to do with that discourse. They were very clear. They wanted their city council to stop focusing so much on how to police them, but to instead focus on how to prevent these types of horrific events from occurring. We believe that the best policy comes from people who are most impacted by the problems. And so we wanted to make sure that community was at the table all the way through. And as we did this listening tour, what we saw is that people wanted to be a part of it. Folks from barbers and beauticians like Troy and Donna, to amazing mindfulness organization, to students, to returning citizens, everybody was saying, we want to be part of this movement for healing in our city.
A Healing Day Summit took place at Coppin State University, where the community came together to provide resources in a celebratory atmosphere. And later that afternoon, hundreds marched to Frederick Douglass High School, where the now named Elijah Cummings Healing City Act was signed by then Mayor Jack Young, the only bill in the country that legislates trauma-informed care. Since the signing, a lot has been happening in Charm City, including a trauma-informed task force, truth and healing community conversations, and trauma-informed care training began occurring at city agencies. The Holistic Life Foundation, a Baltimore-grown organization known for the mindfulness work it was doing in Baltimore City schools and around the world, was tapped to provide the training.
Through this initiative, we've been able to go in and train all the heads of city agencies in, elementary yoga and mindfulness. The next part of the initiative is going into the libraries, training the librarians up in first self-care, because we always start off with self-care, and then elementary practices.
Donna Bruce, a master hairstylist and lobbyist in the fight against sex trafficking, was named to the Trauma-Informed Care Task Force. She is also a certified peer recovery specialist at the Penn North Library.
We have doctors from Johns Hopkins, we have surgeons, we have social workers, we have teachers. And just to have be amongst a great set of people coming from different perspectives and different backgrounds. So I'm coming from a person with lived experience, meaning that I know firsthand what trauma looks like. I know firsthand what it feels like to hurt. And then you find out that it may be a doctor that went through something that was similar to me. And it's like, wow, but we came from two different places. The fact remains that trauma is still the same and healing is possible.
This Healing City movement has helped me realize that trauma is a very deep-rooted issue, and it's very important that we acknowledge it first in order to heal it, because if we don't know it's there, then we don't know how to change the trajectory of things. So yeah, Healing City has helped me heal.
All right. So welcome, everybody from around the world. Really thrilled to be with you on this Healing City Summit. So proud to be in deep partnership with our friends from Open Society Institute and Open Society Foundation. I do want to give a huge thank you to Danielle Terrain, the amazing executive director of Open Society Institute here in Baltimore, who is just an absolute pioneer in bringing together organizations and communities from across the city for healing and for equity and for just rethinking how we do philanthropy and how we support groups from the ground up. And so I am so grateful for the support from OSI, and I'm really excited today to share a little bit, you just saw the video, but to share a little bit more about the work we've been doing around the Healing City Act and making Baltimore the first city in the country to be fully trauma informed through legislation. I'm also thrilled to be here with my partner in the work, Karen Weber, who you're going to hear from a little bit later. All right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Healing City Act and the Healing City movement. So in 2019, there was a shooting outside of the school, inside of the school at Frederick Douglass High School. Now, folks who live in Baltimore know that unfortunately we're a city that experiences a high degree of violence, but to have it happen in a school was particularly traumatic because that is supposed to be the one safe, sacred space that young people can go to. And to hear from teachers who had to lock their doors and have the kids duck in place, to hear from the young people what it was like to have bullets flying by in the hallway. One school staff was shot. Fortunately, he survived and recovered, but it was just a horrific incident for our communities. And so we held a hearing in the Education and Youth Committee of the Baltimore City Council. And the focus was on youth voices, youth violence. And as I mentioned in the video, a lot of the conversation at the time was about, should we be arming our school police? Should we have more metal detectors? How do we harden the targets, was the terminology of our school buildings. But that felt really wrong to the three young people you see in front of you who were juniors at Frederick Douglass at the time. So it's Damani, who's on the microphone, Brianna, who you heard in the video, and Jayana. And their contention was, instead of focusing on how to better police in our school buildings, we should really aim our energy and attention to preventing the day-to-day traumatic experiences that they went through. And they listed every adverse childhood experience in the book having to do with substance use disorder in the family, having to do with food insecurity, issues around homelessness, and just what it's like to be Black growing up in a city that was one of the birthplaces of racial redlining. And so their charge was very clear. That's what we want you as our city council focused on. And don't just do this one-off distraction of the school shooting, focus on what's going on with us. And I'm a former teacher. And so when you hear students speak with that level of eloquence and precision, and it behooves you to listen and to pull them in. And so we spent the next year together doing a listening tour across the city of Baltimore, trying to understand both how people experience trauma and what we could do about it, particularly from the lens of legislation. Because at the end of the day, that is what I do. I'm a policymaker. I'm in the legislative branch of city government. And so we wanted to think about what we could do to legislate around trauma. And one of the interesting things we found as we looked nationally across the globe was that no city at the time had actually legislated trauma-informed care. But as we got going, what we found is that communities across the city wanted to be part of a healing city movement. And particularly what they said was, listen, we have so much amazing work that's already happening here in Baltimore, but too often it's happening in silos. And there's not enough cross collaboration across the medical community, the education community, the nonprofit community. And the other thing people said was, you all as city government need to plant a flag and really show leadership, because too often you all sit back, you cause chaos, and you don't help us clean it up. So you need to be leaders in this movement as well. And so about 8 months later, we held our first ever Healing City Summit. We brought 350 young people to Morgan State for panels, poetry, and TED Talks. The young woman in front of you is an amazing poet, and she dropped the mic right after this scene. And then we went to Coppin State University, which is our other historically Black college and university, and we had a big community day of healing where we had nonprofits doing their thing. We had a DJ, we had barbers and beauticians giving out free haircuts. And one of the real learnings for me from doing the work was that barbers and beauticians really wanted to be part of this Healing City movement. And I'll never forget my friend Troy Stanton, who's mentioned in the video, putting his arm on my shoulder and saying, listen, you know, we are healers in our communities as barbers. This is a guy who was shot in his own barbershop, who survived, and who created a nonprofit called More Than a Shop, where he provides medical services and support to other barbers and beauticians. And what he said was, you know, when someone gets in that chair, they're vulnerable, they're able to have a real conversation, and there's something incredibly therapeutic about the way we touch folks. Like literally, we put our hands on people's heads in a way that's really vulnerable. And we touch both victims of violence and we touch the shooters. And you will never know whether that one touch may have prevented someone from going out and using their weapon. And to me, that was really profound and just emblematic of the need for all of us to work together. We then marched over to Frederick Douglass High School, where the young people spoke about what it was like, not just to have this horrific incident, but then to really do something about it, to not only testify, but to write legislation. And then our mayor at the time, Jack Young, signed the bill right there at the high school. making Baltimore the first city in America to legislate trauma-informed care into city governance. And it was a really proud moment for our city. So what does our bill do? It mandates trauma-responsive training for all of our city agencies. It calls for a review of policies and procedures to ensure they're trauma-informed and equitable. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And it creates a community task force of 38 people to oversee progress and work on multiple initiatives and strategies to reduce trauma. All right, whoops. So this is our faculty, our training faculty. And what we're really proud of is that everybody who's part of this work is a Baltimorean. What we really found was that we don't need other folks from consultants from New York or DC. We have all the brilliance and healing we need right here in our own city. And so people like Dr. Lawrence Brown, who talks about systemic racism and how it's shaped our city, folks like Shauna Murray Brown, who talks about epigenetic intergenerational trauma, the guy you saw in the video, Ottman, and his brother, Ollie Smith, who are with us today, incredible practitioners in mindfulness. But the point is that we know that healing is going to come from within, and that we as Baltimoreans need to define what it looks like. And so we're really proud that all the folks we've brought on are Baltimore-based people or organizations. This is a shot of our task force getting sworn in, or at least a part of it. That's our Mayor Brandon Scott swearing us in. This is an article that was written about some of the work. Our first agency to get trained is the Enoch Pratt Free Library System. And so this is the Trace. They're a magazine or an online magazine that's focused mostly on gun violence. And the article is about Baltimore bets on a new type of first responder, the librarian. And it profiled the work we've been doing to support our librarians and teach them how to identify trauma, how to work with folks who've experienced it, how to come from a restorative approach instead of just being punitive, and really how to deputize them to be first responders, as it says. One of the policy changes was we looked at the library system, and one of the things that was unfortunate is that we had a zero tolerance policy for anyone that came into the library and was suspected of being either drunk or high. And you can understand that, it's difficult to have someone who may be inebriated in a public space, but we know that in the year 2022, addiction is a disease. And the idea of criminalizing it or kicking people out of public spaces is not only not trauma informed, but it's actually doing real harm. So what the director of the library system did is she got rid of that policy, and she instead brought peer recovery coaches like Donna, who you saw in the video, into the library. And these are folks who support people struggling with addiction. They've got Narcan, they've got, they bring hope and healing. And it's just been an amazing pilot so far. So I wanted to mention that this work is really the product of a public-private partnership with Open Society Foundations. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart, which is that none of this would be possible without OSF and without Open Society Institute. They made the first major investment financially in the work when it was just a completely unfunded mandate. And their leadership and real deep thought partnership has been one of the driving forces of how we've been able to accomplish all of this. And I want to especially shout out, and we're going to bring her on in a minute, my friend Karen Weber, who has just been an extraordinary partner in the work, as well as Danielle and everyone there. After we got some money from OSF, Mayor Brandon Scott made a large investment in the work as well. So he dedicated $1.4 million of our ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act money. And again, because we were able to get it going through OSF. We then were able to leverage that initial contribution and get the mayor to give as well. And I will say, Mayor Scott has been a real champion for this work, but the 1.4 million from ARPA has been huge. What have we been able to accomplish? We passed legislation to make us the first city in the country to be trauma informed by law. We've trained, I should say trained, not tamed, but we've trained city agency heads. We wanted to start at the top. The mayor got trained. We all got trained. We started with folks in leadership, city council and agency heads, because we know this doesn't work if leadership isn't bought in. We trained 450 librarians, and these are deep dives. This is not like a one-off hour and a half miniature professional development. This is a year-long deep dive. We are really seeking culture change, not just not just to do a QCPD. We also train media, because the way that media talks about people in our cities really matters. And we all know this, but the portrayal of particularly young Black men as criminals that we see every night on the news is extremely damaging and extremely problematic. And so we did a training specifically for media. Some journalists showed up, others did not, but we thought it was important to include them as well. Some lessons learned. We think that legislation really matters. The law itself, the Healing City Act, anchors the work, and it creates sustainability for when I'm dead and gone and the mayor's gone and all the rest. There's still this law that exists. The work takes funding. And again, this is where OSF has been instrumental, is that they were the first to really see the potential and make an investment. But I think we should not kid ourselves that when we're doing systems change, when we're doing deep culture change, especially within government, it costs money. You got to pay people for their labor. So I want to stress that. Third is that we are the medicine, whether you're in Baltimore or Cincinnati or St. Louis or Seattle. It's really incumbent on us to identify folks from within our communities that have the capacity to be part of driving change. I would not look at other places. I mean, there's a good template. It's always good to be not be provincial and look at other cities, but you got to find the folks from within that can lead the work. On that note, community and government have to work together. What we've been most proud of is that the movement has continued, and this is actually our third Healing City Summit. We had over 750 people show up this week at our summit. So it has continued to propel the work that we've been doing in government forward. And then finally, systems change is a long game. This is generational work. It does not happen overnight. My hope is that it will outlive my relatively brief tenure as a city council person. But really, it's about how do we impact folks who are here now, but also the next generation. With that, I'm going to stop my little PowerPoint, and I'm going to welcome my good friend Karen Weber, who is the one of the true brains behind this operation. Karen was a pioneer here in Baltimore in restorative practices and seeded that and made it a programmatic element of our school system, and now has been an incredible partner in the Healing City work. And so Karen, wanted to just hear from you sort of why you chose to be part of this and why you feel this kind of work is important.
Oh, well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for having me today. And Zeke, I think it's funny that you're asking why I chose. I got this cold call from Zeke, and on the call he was like, you may not know me very well, but we're gonna do something amazing and you've gotta be part of it. So with that challenge, I began to listen to what our council member was talking about, and it was really exciting. It was an opportunity to weave together some of the work that was happening across Baltimore City into a real focal point and into a movement so that we could make substantive change, not little pockets of change here and there, but bring the players all together and have them focus on this activity, which is critical to every city in America, and healing. And this was before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, it's more important than it's ever been. One of the things is that we were just wrapping up a project, and I don't know if we should call it a project or a movement or an initiative, but we were just wrapping up a project in Baltimore City Public Schools, where 15 schools were piloted with intensive restorative practices. The Positive School Center, which is another, which are some other advocates and practitioners in our city, and a group called ACOBED, were seeding restorative practices in our schools. And the idea was to change from a punitive environment where kids are punished for everything. Even if the bus is late and you come in late, then you're punished again when you come in. Many of our children, as we know, have adult responsibilities. And so they're taking their little brothers and sisters to school before they get to school. And you get to school and you're punished again. So moving out of that punitive mindset into one that asks questions. How are you? What's going on? Why is this happening? What's going on? What can we do to help you? Just changing that sort of mindset made such a huge difference in these schools. And we tested them out for over a year. We provided coaching and training just for about a year. And at the end of that year, we saw a 44% decline in out-of-school suspensions, which was unheard of for a pilot. And in addition to that, the teachers and the students and the administrators said, this is good work. This is something we're going to sustain. So when Zeke came to me and was talking about healing the city, I jumped ahead. We hadn't even passed the legislation yet. I jumped way ahead and I was like, okay, so what practices are we going to adopt? And so I had to sort of be reeled back in and wait my turn. But now we're at a place where we can take some of the evidence-based practices, like restorative practices, like mindfulness that is done by Holistic Life, and begin to seed them into the communities. Because if the children are getting doses of this medicine, but they go home and that medicine isn't being applied at home, or they go to a city agency, and instead of being treated like customers and clients, they're treated like adversaries, then we haven't done our job. This was a way to holistically begin to talk about those interventions that can really change trajectories.
Karen, you've been a principal in a public school. Can you talk about generally, you mentioned sort of this shift away from punitive as the first approach. Can you talk about just the general climate that particularly young people, but educators as well, experience in city schools, and some of the challenges that young people bring into the classroom, and why it's so important to engage restorative practices, and then ultimately why it's so important that our entire city adopts this trauma-informed healing frame?
Thank you for that, Zeke. I think the school was a microcosm of many of our communities in Baltimore City. We read the headlines and see that 3 people were murdered over the weekend, or this one was assaulted, this thing happened to that person. Then we distance ourselves from that activity. Well, the children are living that activity. And it's not like they can drop that at the school door and come on into school and just be fine and dandy. That trauma is embedded within their systems. And it's not just the children, obviously, it's the adults, it's our elder folks who often feel most vulnerable. And unless we do something holistically, we've really failed to meet the mark. We can't arrest our way out of this issue. The problem has been going on for hundreds of years, It's endemic to the foundation of our society. Some of the issues that there is, we speak about free speech, but then we're afraid to let people talk. Using a schoolhouse again as an example, you can go through the halls of a good school and never hear children being asked their opinion. How can we not ask children their opinion? But I would say the same is true for some of our agencies or other organizational structures. The hierarchy is such that the people at the top not only make the decisions, but they have the voice. But these practices ensure that everybody really has an opportunity to be heard and to listen and be in a conversation. And believe it or not, I mean, our ancient societies know that that's what's healing. One thing I'll say about restorative practices, most people know about that practice through circles, which is a fundamental way to really push out restorative practices. You sit in a circle and someone asks an open-ended question, and then there's a conversation that ensues. One of the things I was asked is like, is that culturally appropriate in a predominantly African-American city? Well, first of all, it has legs across the world. And second of all, the first time I ever sat in a restorative circle was in a place called Galumbecho in Senegal, West Africa. And they were having a problem with water. And they sat down in a circle, brought everyone into the circle and sat down and had a conversation. This is an ancient practice. It worked then. There's a reason that it's an archetype and we see it across cultures. And the idea now is to bring it, at least right now, throughout our city and to help other cities that are beginning to bring this practice as well. Last thing I'll say is that to combine this with mindfulness is the ticket. Mindfulness is a way to get to the trauma that you feel personally, to help you self-regulate, to help you keep a tap on, like, really what's going on with me? Am I stressed and how can I bring that down? Restorative circles are a way to do that with community. Okay, we have a problem. The only way to solve the problem can't be that I pull out a gun and shoot somebody. That can't be the way we get to this. It gives people tools to work with. And that's what we're trying to do with Healing City Baltimore. Not just have the legislation on the books and not just do trainings where people listen to new concepts, but really teach them how to apply those concepts in ways that are meaningful to their day-to-day life.
And I want to build off of what you were saying. My own experiences, I taught in Sandtown, Winchester, taught middle school, and then in Curtis Bay, which for those that are not Baltimoreans, first off, welcome. But also to know these are both communities with significant amount of trauma. Sandtown is where Freddie Gray grew up and was killed in police custody, which really sparked our uprising here in our city. Curtis Bay is a place that has a huge incinerator in the middle of the community right next to the school. And so you see unusually high rates of asthma and cancer. And I think what I experienced as a teacher, building off of what you said, is young people and community would bring all of this into their school. We had young people who had been poisoned by lead paint. We had young people who were dealing with a family member who had been killed or incarcerated. We had young people who were either homeless or living couch to couch and just sort of staying with a different relative or maybe someone who's not a relative, but just in a really precarious, unsafe situation. We saw all of this, but as a teacher, I really didn't have the words or the discourse or the ability to engage it. And I think that a lot of what we're taught here in the United States is to suppress our stuff and like, doesn't matter what just happened at home, you got to show up ready to cram and learn because we got this standardized test coming up. And so you better sit in that seat and be present. But that's not possible, right? Like we know enough about the human brain at this point. We know enough about the neurobiology of trauma to know that when your prefrontal cortex is activated at all times, you really can't sit there and learn and be present and have normal, positive relationships, that all of that functioning, primary functioning, really suffers. And it's evidence-based and it's science. It's not just hokey. And so I think that, to me, this shift that you've seeded around restorative practices and that we're attempting to seed within our city government is really about opening a different conversation and thinking about how, as a city, we move away from the constant punitive, if you don't do this, I'm going to take this away, to acknowledging what is actually happening and then working on helping folks to heal, which again is long-term, really hard work. One thing I wanted to lift up and sort of throw to you is, I think that context is really important in all of this. Baltimore, in addition to being the first city to have legislated trauma-informed care, we were also the first city to have legislated residential segregation into our city code in 1910. We were pioneers in redlining, which, for those that don't know, was a way that, with collusion from the FHA, banks would not lend in majority Black neighborhoods, thus really denying wealth in Black communities. We had racial housing covenants that barred Blacks and often Jews from living in certain neighborhoods. We are really like ground zero of racial inequality. Karen, let's talk a little bit about just sort of the importance in this work of trauma-informed or restorative, of acknowledging and being honest about inequities and how we got here, instead of just rushing into, let's do deep breathing and, let's go from there. I think there's a really important piece that we've tried to embed in the work around having hard conversations about racism and white supremacy and other forms of injustice.
No, that's spot on, Zeke. One thing I'll say, and it sounds a little hokey, but when people sit in conversation in those circles, you get to the issues of race and poverty and trauma, but it's sort of through the back door. What I have found is when you introduce those subjects up front, people are very defensive and very little goes through, and people start to use their defense mechanisms. They're crying or they're mad or whatever the case may be, and so it doesn't really seep in. But when you sit in a circle and what you're really displaying is your own humanity, there's something irrefutable about one's humanity. And it makes people connect with one another in a different way. I know that even as an educator, because that's where I came in contact with restorative practices. The first year of teaching, I had come from another profession and I was like, what am I doing? The second year, when I had restorative practices and started to hear the kids' stories, for the first time, I really understood who was sitting in my classroom. I couldn't reach them until I knew who they were. And then they even began to know who I was. I had come from New York, and so any questions about my personal business was like, what are you asking me that for? You can imagine how that went down. That didn't go very well. But when we could sit in a circle and be humans first, then that enabled me as an older, African-American from a different place to really see who my kids were. And it does the same thing for white teachers who come from, Wisconsin, or for Asian teachers who have just come to this country. It brings us to our humanity. And that's what we're really seeking to do. I just want to say a quick thing about the role of funder, and then I can be quiet. I think that what we've done here in Baltimore and what OSF seeks to do across the world is be a different kind of funder. It's not just about writing a check and sending the check off and hoping that things go well. It's about being involved, not being overbearing, which sometimes we may be perceived as being, but we're playing multiple roles: advocate, convener. Sometimes we're on speaking panels. We're coming in with a certain expertise. We try to stay within our bounds, but I think it's important for us to be on the ground to see what's happening so that we can bend and flex with you, and so that we can provide the monies that are needed to fill the gaps. The fact that the city is coming through with really big dollars will help us sustain these processes. But our funding can help leverage, our funding can help fill gaps. And I think that's how funders need to be a little bit more humble and see themselves as helpers and not the solution makers. So that's what I wanted to impart about where we're trying to go.
No, and I think that's exactly right. And I think, to me, and I know we're getting the wrap it up signal, so I'm going to pass it back to you in a minute to introduce our next amazing practitioners and speakers. But I think, to me, that's been the best part of this work, is that it's been a genuine relationship and not a transaction. I think that Karen and I have been able to work really closely, and as well as our entire team, and really problem solve. And again, Danielle and Evan and just the whole crew from Open Society has been amazing. And to me, what's been best about this work that we've done is that it really is, I think, government and community and philanthropy all working together on something, and nobody needing to grab the spotlight or make it about their project or their program. It really has felt like everybody's been able to come to the table and find their place within this movement.